Don't panic, don't panic, don't panic!
How many times have you heard those words over the past few weeks? But we sometimes do, don't we? Especially when we're not sure of what is actually happening or what the outcome of a situation might be. Those infamous words of Clive Dunn ring true so many times. I wonder if it was the same for the disciples after the turmoil of Good Friday. Did they panic, not knowing what was going to happen? Then 3 days later, events took a different turn. Once again, the Master had gone, and the message he gave to Mary was that he was returning to his Father. What did that mean for them? That night, as they met in a locked room because they were frightened, Jesus came and stood among them and offered peace, offered them the Spirit, gave some instruction, and then left. But one of the disciples wasn't there that night. Afterwards, the disciples told him what had happened, but he didn't believe. If we turn to John's Gospel, we meet the disciples a week later. So John chapter 20, verses 26 to 31. A week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here. See my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." Thomas said to him, "My Lord and my God." Then Jesus told him, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." Jesus did many other miraculous signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. So here we are today, on the octave day of Easter, or White Sunday, or Low Sunday. There are so many names for this day. Some even call it Thomas Sunday. And that is where our thoughts turn to Thomas. Thomas, who probably uttered many times some other words that we probably have heard over the past weeks. Thomas, the private phraser of the New Testament. I suppose in part doubting Thomas does deserve his label, but he also shows us, in his confrontation with the risen Christ, that there is a way through doubt to faith. Let's look at Thomas's faith and temperament. Thomas first appears in the Gospel in the story of the rising of Lazarus. When Jesus gets the message from Martha and Mary that Lazarus was sick, he told the disciples they would return to Judea. It would have been a dangerous journey for Jesus to take, and the disciples weren't happy. But when there was no turning Jesus, Thomas, with a shrug of his shoulders and his pessimistic nature, said to the rest, "Let us go also, that we may die with him." Thomas knew the journey would end in failure or disaster. He was sure of that. Yet if Jesus insisted on returning, he was resigned to follow, for his loyalty or courage was never in question. Thankfully, it didn't end the way Thomas thought. The pessimism of Thomas prevails again during the second time we meet him, this time at the Last Supper. Jesus had just reassured the disciples, "Do not let your hearts be troubled." Jesus had given some hope to his disciples, but with his characteristic down-to-earth bluntness, Thomas interrupted Jesus. "Come off it," we hear him say. "I haven't seen the slightest trace of the Father's house. I have no idea where you're going. I don't know the way. If you're going to die now, we might as well die too." No amount of reassurance from Jesus could break through the wall of pessimism that Thomas had put up around his life. No amount of encouragement could lighten the gloom inside. That was just the kind of person he was. Glass half empty and all that. Good things always seem too good to be true, and bad things happen all too easily. If we have a pessimistic view, it does little good to pretend that faith comes easily to everyone. Some people find things more difficult than others. If we recognize ourselves in Thomas, maybe we need to look at our outlook. Is our failure to believe in God's power rarely a failure to know ourselves? So let's look at Thomas's faith and attitude. A pessimistic temperament is one thing. What you do with it is another. The first may be legitimate, the second may be controlled. Thomas could not help his pessimistic character, but he could have helped his behaviour. His first mistake was to indulge in solitude. When the other disciples met together on the evening of the resurrection, Thomas was not there. When Jesus appeared to them, turning their fear and anxiety into joy and peace, Thomas was not there. Instead, he kept himself to himself. He was sulking and wouldn't talk to anyone or discuss the matter with anyone. Thomas's second mistake was to make his skepticism worse by speaking emphatically about it. When the disciples told him what had happened, he said, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my fingers where the nails were, and put my hand in his side, I will not believe." Speech so often gives power to attitude. We can almost hear him saying, "I told you that disaster would happen, and now it has. Let's not kid ourselves. The women imagined the angel. You have all been hallucinating." The more he talked, the stronger his disbelief became. His third mistake was to insist on signs. He wanted tangible evidence. He demanded the nail prints, but he didn't really expect to see them. Unbelief was important to him. Perhaps even then he had warranted his title of Doubting Thomas. His disbelief had gained him a certain infamy. It was attention-catching. It gave him a certain status in his own eyes, and he didn't want to part with it easily. How about Thomas's faith and sight? A week later the disciples met again, once again behind locked doors, but this time Thomas was there. No doubt the others had urged him to be there, and perhaps he had agreed to come as some kind of test, to see if Jesus would actually show up. Whatever the reason, Thomas was there, and suddenly Jesus was there saying, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here. See my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." Jesus met his demands step by step. He challenged Thomas to carry out his test. Yes, faith in the resurrection was difficult, but not impossible, and Jesus deliberately met Thomas on his own ground, in the midst of his doubting, offering him visible and tangible proof in order to create belief. The next step was up to Thomas. Could he set aside all his natural temperament and believe? There must have been a period of silence as faith struggled with doubt inside Thomas. It's not easy in a moment to overturn the habit of a lifetime. But Thomas passed his test. In one exclamation, "My Lord and my God," he moved from pessimism to faith, from skepticism to belief. In the first part of his statement, he recognized that Jesus standing before him was the same Jesus that he loved and followed. Then he acknowledged Christ's divinity, "My God." Here before him was his risen Lord, and therefore his God. For if death held no power over him, he must be divine. It was no longer intellectual doubt, but it was now personal. Thomas's faith came by sight. The skeptic in us may still be saying, "If only I could see, then I would believe." Perhaps some are hiding behind their skepticism, secure in the knowledge that they can't know about the resurrection for sure, so are unwilling to confront Jesus by faith. Thomas was hiding behind his skepticism, holding out for conditions that he did not expect to be filled. Tangible proof of the resurrected Jesus, however, is not confined to the apostolic age. Whenever good is returned for evil, blessing for cursing, love for hate, Jesus once again shows the power of his resurrection in the tangible, visible lives of the people we encounter. In every act of good and kindness and love, Jesus shows us the nail prints and wounds of his resurrected body. We've seen that quite a lot over the past weeks, and we've played our part in that as we've supported each other in the times we're going through. Faith in the resurrection is difficult, especially for those like Thomas who have a pessimistic temperament and who are naturally inclined towards skepticism. But Jesus stands ready to meet them, just as he met Thomas at that point of pessimism and unbelief, just as he created faith in the travellers on the road to Emmaus by opening the scriptures to them. So he stands ready through his Spirit to open the word to our understanding. It is then left for us to cry, I do believe, help me overcome my unbelief. So here then is the challenge. When we hear those who are pessimistic and sceptical say those infamous words,
We're doomed. Don't panic, don't panic, don't panic!
Stay positive and realise that although we might not be doing what we normally do, through the lives and witness of his saints, Christ can and will still confront the skeptic and offer visible, tangible proof of his resurrection. Let us believe that as we continue to support each other, our friends, neighbours and family. Lord, help us in our lives for you, that others may see the resurrected Christ through us. Amen.